So, where we left off, Darwin is first living in rented rooms in London once he gets back from his Beagle voyage, spends several years hanging around with the London scientific establishment. Remember that at this time, there are very few jobs for scientists as we now define it. But there is a network of people interested in science, many of them lawyers, doctors, ministers, or the independently wealthy who have enough time and enough money to indulge a taste for scientific research. So Darwin is big in with this circle, and he has his hands full because he writes up and oversees the editing of the scientific reports that the Beagle voyage produced. There were official reports on the animals and the fossils that they brought back. Darwin's own diary was originally published as part of the official records of the Beagle expedition. It's now printed separately under the title Voyage of the Beagle, and it's still not a bad read. Darwin is also beginning in the early 1840s, beginning to suffer from these attacks of illness. He and his new wife move out of London to a country village called Down, which is now a suburb of London. And Darwin is pretty reclusive for the rest of his life. It gets really hard for him to travel. Even having people over for dinner will exhaust him for days afterwards. He's, very weak, very delicate digestion, manages to live a very full life, but most of it is spent unhealthy. That does mean that he does have a lot of free time to do science because he's not having to go to dinner parties and things like that. It does mean that he can legitimately drop out of the social round. And so he's got time to ponder the problem of where species might come from. That page in his notebook is dated the year after the Beagle got back. We don't really know when he started to think about the possibility of species changing. It may have been on the voyage. Certainly, it was very soon after. And this is why you need to pay attention in your core classes. He wasn't just reading biology. He read in the scientific journals of the time and corresponded with top scientists in Britain and in Europe, and even made a pen pal in America, a botanist at Harvard named Asa Gray. But he also read history and economics and sociology. He read all of that liberal arts stuff that administrators around the country secretly want to kill, including the works of these two gentlemen that affected him very strongly. Let's look at what they did. Adam Smith, he's not mentioned in The Day the Universe Changed. He was long dead by this time. He wrote a book called Wealth of Nations, which is an economic argument for basically a market economy. He argued that if you have unregulated economic competition, what that will do is maximize profits, boost quality, and give you reasonable prices. And I always explain this by imagining that you wake up one morning and you find that 20 shoe stores have opened in Valonia. Okay, I'm not sure if there's 20 people that wear shoes in Valonia. Sorry, just kidding. Hope nobody's from there. If you are, I'll talk more slowly. Obviously, there's not enough customers in Valonia to keep 20 shoe stores going. So many of them would probably close. Some of them might manage to stay open. And okay, Greenbrier better than Valonia. Maybe so. We can have that argument another time. Okay, so many of those shoe stores would shut down. The ones that had the best prices and or the best quality and or the best service would be the ones that would stay open. The ones that sold bad shoes or overly expensive shoes or ill-fitting shoes or shoes with bad service, those are the ones that are going to close. Stores that set their prices higher than people want to pay will go out of business. Stores that set their prices too low will go out of business. Somewhere in between, there's a happy medium that is a fair price. Oops, I advanced the slides a little bit too soon. So simple competition will give you a more efficient economy than having some bunch of commissars or whatever deciding how many shoes every store can sell and what prices they can sell them for, instead of top-down control of the economy where the government tells you what the right prices are and how much you can make. If you let everybody compete, you end up with fairer prices, rewards for the innovators, people who come up with ways to make better shoes or just as good shoes for a lower price more efficiently or something like that. You end up with fair prices that are a compromise between the greed of the shoe sellers and the stinginess of the shoe buyers. Division of labor gets quoted. People can specialize into new market niches. So one store might sell athletic shoes and another might specialize in tennis shoes or designer footwear or something like that. And Smith referred to competition like that as an invisible hand. That keeps the economy orderly and stable without the need for external designers, without the need for people to come in and tell you how it's going to be. That's the beginning of an answer to William Paley, although we're not going to get the full picture for some time. Be it said, by the way, that Smith also recognized the dangers of monopolies and big producers crowding out the little guys. I've kind of made him sound like your libertarian uncle at Thanksgiving, but he wasn't opposed to all market regulation and believed there was a role for government to play. He was pretty moderate. But this particular feature of his thought was something that Darwin took notice of. And he also read someone who was mentioned briefly in The Day the Universe Changed. That's Thomas Malthus, who wrote a book called Essay on the Principles of Population. Malthus was I guess you'd call him a proto-sociologist. There were people at the time, there was poverty in Britain at the time, because the Industrial Revolution was starting to move people off the land and into the cities to provide labor for growing factories and things like that. Remember that when Darwin is a young man reading all of this stuff is the time that Charles Dickens is describing what society is like. And if even just A Christmas Carol, there are people like Tiny Tim and other desperately poor people in the cities. And there were social theorists like a guy named William Godwin, who had advocated more financial aid to the poor. Malthus argued that if you looked at any given country, over time, the food supply tended to increase. And it increased because people would clear more land for farming. They developed more efficient ways of farming, better plows and things like that. They would develop new crops with higher yields. So you can make a country produce more and more food over time, but that increase tends to be linear, while population increases geometrically, right? Population doubles after a fixed time interval. It increases exponentially, as we'd say it now. And no matter how much you give to the poor, they'll breed and they'll make more, and the population will ultimately outstrip the food supply. Politically, that means not that we shouldn't do something about poverty, and Malthus did encourage things like better education on the grounds that if you give women more things to do with their brains, they'll find other things to do than just cranking out a kid every year. If you give them more opportunities to develop other faculties than childbearing, so in some ways that's pretty good. He did advocate prudent restraint from marriage and things like that, his words. But ultimately, you were always going to have poor people with you because any population of humans would ultimately outstrip its resource base. And that means that simple-minded, take everything from the rich and give it to the poor type liberalism isn't going to work. Now, don't necessarily take this too seriously for a guide to modern politics. I mean, one of our big problems is that we produce plenty for everybody. It just doesn't get distributed very well. And Malthus was a more complex thinker than the kind of, cartoon conservative that I've made him. But as far as Darwin goes, Darwin wrote in his autobiography that he happened to read Malthus's essay and realized that Malthus's reasoning happened in other species as well. There was what Darwin called a struggle for existence, in that any population is capable of growing larger than its resource base. If any of you hunt, you may know that, if we didn't hunt deer, the deer population would grow so large that they devour all of the food, and then you'd have famines. That actually happened on the north rim of the Grand Canyon back in, I want to say, around 1900, 1910. There was a very severe die-off of the deer population because there weren't any predators left. Nobody was hunting them. They ate all of the available plant material, and then many of them died in the resulting famine. So any population, humans, deer, bacteria, grass, whatever, is capable of outstripping its resources, whether that's available food or available sunlight per square meter, whatever it might be. And it struck Darwin that under these circumstances, favorable variations would tend to be preserved and unfavorable ones to be destroyed. The results of this would be the formation of a new species. So Darwin takes Malthus's ideas on human societies and applies them to the natural world as a whole. And that's where he gets his idea of natural selection. Remember that Darwin is not the first person to come up with the idea of evolutionary change over time. You can trace that back to the ancient Greeks. He's not even the first to come up with a theory of what causes evolution. That's pretty much Lamarck. What he comes up with is a mechanism for driving evolution called natural selection. And as he wrote in 1844, I determined to collect blindly every sort of fact which could bear any way on what are species. I am almost convinced, quite contrary to the opinion I started with, that species are not immutable. Species are not unchanging. As he said, it is like confessing a murder. And it goes like this. In any population of any species, individuals vary. No one knew why at the time. You have to remember when you're learning the history of this time that as far as genetics goes, everybody is flying blind. In the 1840s, I think Mendel's a teenager, if memory serves. Certainly a very young man, certainly a long way away from breeding his pea plants in the monastery in Brno. Nobody really understands how genetics works, but even if you don't, you can see that individuals in a population vary. All of you are different. All of my cats are different. Every blade of grass out there on my lawn is different if I could go in and explore and look closely enough. Every tomato in your garden this summer is a little different if you look at it closely. Any population, individuals will vary, some more than others, some more obviously than others, but everybody varies. And we know that variation is inherited. Individuals have a way of passing on their traits. You look more like your biological parents than you look like two randomly selected people on the street. If you have kids, they will look more like you than they look like some rando. Your dogs and cats, if you have them, look more like their parents than they do like random animals. And so on. This is fundamentally true for all of life, even if nobody knew quite how it happened because nobody understood DNA yet. So individuals vary. The variation is inherited. And individuals vary in every species, from people to poppies to Polistes paper wasps, which is what you're looking at here. Yeah, those are paper wasps. That's from a paper that showed that paper wasps in a colony can actually recognize the faces of individual wasps in their colony. They're smart enough to do that. And that variation gets passed on. Part two, we get into Malthus. Any species, in theory, can increase its population exponentially, right? Doubling its population after a fixed time interval. But we don't actually see this in nature because populations will tend to hold roughly constant or at least fluctuate within limits. I mean, occasionally you'll get extinctions, occasionally you'll get booms, like a locust swarm or something like that. But it's never permanent. No population can increase exponentially indefinitely. If you had one bacterium and one E. coli bacterium and you put it in perfect conditions and gave it all of the nutrients it needed at just the right temperature, everything perfect, it could divide every 20 minutes. And if you let it do that, in a week, you would have a glob of bacteria the size of the Earth. No, in 24 hours, you'd have a glob of bacteria the size of the Earth. It's even faster than that. In a week, you'd have more bacteria than there are atoms in the known universe. Obviously, that does not happen. So something is keeping populations in check. Darwin concluded that not all of the offspring that are produced can survive. Darwin called this mismatch between what organisms can do and what their environment enables them to do as far as reproducing goes. He called it the struggle for existence. That's a term you've got to be careful about misusing, because when I say struggle for existence, you're probably thinking of, I don't know, a lion chasing down and savagely tearing the flesh of a helpless gazelle on the Serengeti plain, or a shark savagely tearing the flesh of a helpless mackerel, or whatever's on Shark Week on Animal Planet, whatever it is that you watch. And predation can be part of it, but as Darwin pointed out, you could have trees in a forest and they're not punching each other, unless they're ants. Trees don't get up and beat each other up. I mean, except for, Lord of the Rings. But there's still only a fixed amount of sunlight that the Earth receives per square meter. And tall trees will tend to block that sun and intercept it first and keep it from falling on the shorter trees. Tall trees are really kind of mean about it because they tend to throw shade. Right. That's the metaphorical struggle for existence that goes on in any species. It's not necessarily predation, but it is true that there's this mismatch between how large populations can grow and what resource base they have for growth. Part three, some individuals in any population will vary in ways that increase their chances of surviving and, much more importantly, their chances of reproducing. Some trees will be able to grow just a little bit taller than their neighbors, just a little bit faster, or maybe some trees will develop leaves just a little bit broader that can intercept more light. Or some trees might develop some new twist on photosynthesis that makes them just a little bit better at growing in low light conditions, so they're not as inconvenienced by the taller trees throwing shade. Some individuals will vary in ways that increase the odds that they'll reproduce. Others vary in ways that decrease their chances. If we have a population of rabbits in a forest that are getting eaten by wolves, some rabbits will vary in ways that increase the odds that they won't get eaten. Some rabbits will be a little faster than others. Some rabbits will blend in better than others. Some rabbits might be, I don't know, more quicker to run away when they sense danger, better able to hear predators coming or something like that. Others will vary in ways that decrease their chances. Some rabbits will stick out more, some rabbits will be slower, some rabbits will be more stupid. Some rabbits will just think they can punch the wolf in the nose and he'll go away. And the conclusion is that over several generations, some traits in a population will become common. Other traits will become rare or they'll disappear completely. Given enough time, separated populations may become so different from each other that we can consider them different species. Now, I'll talk in an upcoming lecture as to exactly what we mean by a species. Leave that aside for right now, but separate populations will diverge from each other, and they'll eventually diverge so far that you have to recognize that they've become different. Well, Darwin wrote this up and decided that he wanted to see how this worked in an actual group. And so he ended up raising fancy pigeons. I don't know if any of y'all have seen these, but I had a friend of mine who lived in Indiana and used to raise fancy pigeons. There are hundreds of breeds of really, really weird looking pigeons. Those of you that have seen the video got a look at some of them. So here you've got up at the top, that's a pouter, slender bird that keeps inflating its upper digestive tract so it looks like its neck is blowing a bubble. Down at the lower left, there's a couple of fantails that have these enormous tails. Between the pouter and the fantails, that's a barb pigeon, I think, with big ruffles of naked skin around its eyes and its beak, and so on. There's some more fancy pigeons for you. As he wrote, "It is always best to study some special group. I have taken up domestic pigeons. I have kept every breed which I could purchase or obtain. The diversity of the breeds is something astonishing." And you can see it can be pretty astonishing right there. There's a fantail at the upper right. And I think that's an English tumbler up in the center. And then there's another barb pigeon at the lower center, and so on. Yeah, lots of crazy pigeons out there. And here was the thing. They all descended from this. This is the wild rock pigeon. This one's native to Southern Europe and Asia, but it's been introduced. We have flocks of this thing living. I usually see a big flock down by the railroad tracks in Conway, right? These are the little feathered rats that beat up old ladies and take their breadcrumbs. That's what wild pigeons look like. And a few years ago, I was reading an Amazon review of Darwin's book on all of this, on the origin of species. And one of the reviewers was really confused because he picked up this book by Darwin and was expecting, a double-barreled, two-fisted, all-out assault on God, Jesus, Mom, apple pie, the Constitution, and Santa Claus. And was really kind of disappointed to find that the first chapter is mostly about pigeons. It's like going, wait, what? It's not as evil as I thought it might be? Huh? But yeah, the first chapter of his book is mostly about pigeons, and Darwin goes into the history of pigeon raising, which he traces back to one of the early dynasties in Egypt. So at least since the days of ancient Egypt, people have been keeping pigeons, originally for food, but people who've been keeping pigeons have been choosing individuals that have traits that they like. Prettier feathers, brighter colors, more meat, whatever it might be, setting aside the individuals with traits that they liked and encouraging those pigeons to breed, while the pigeons that don't have traits that they like end up on the barbecue. Wash, rinse, and repeat the process over many generations, and you can go from the common rock pigeon to the Bukhara trumpeter, whose feet are completely buried in feathers and whose head is completely buried in feathers as well. There is a face somewhere in all of that, but it's kind of hard to find. And you can go from the wild rock pigeon to the English pouter, which keeps inflating its crop, the upper part of its digestive tract, and walks around looking like, this lollipop with bird legs or something like that. Because people have continued ever since then to pick out birds with traits that they like, even if you have to be kind of a weirdo to like English pouters, if you ask me. Save those individuals, let them breed. Pigeons that don't have the traits that you want end up on the hibachi. And so you've gone from the rock pigeon to the Bukhara and the English pouter and the English barb on the left, and the frillback with its curly feathers on the right, and the short-faced tumbler on the left compared with the scandaroon on the right. There's actually an entire website dedicated to Darwin's pigeons. They actually have some of the birds that Darwin himself raised and ended up, taking the skeleton or stuffing and mounting the bird when he was finished with them. That collection has been partially preserved. So yeah, if you're curious, there's more. And they weren't just differences of feather color. They affected the skeleton. The wild rock pigeon is up there at the top left. B at the top right, that's that short-faced tumbler. And D, I think, is that scandaroon. So top left and then bottom are the skulls of these two pigeons that I just showed you. And you can see they differ not just in the size of the beak, but even in proportions. Like the back of the skull is a lot longer in D than it is in B or even in A, the wild pigeon. There are differences in body proportions. There's even differences in behavior. The one in the middle, that's the short-faced tumbler again. That one's called that because it flies and does somersaults as it's flying. Kind of a neat trick. On the left, that's a racing pigeon or homing pigeon. These are the ones that have been bred for speed and navigation. People will race these pigeons by driving them away from their homes and then letting them go and seeing how long it takes them to get back. And homing pigeons can navigate home from as far away as 1,100 miles, flying at an average speed of 50 miles an hour. These are related to the carrier pigeons that used to be carry messages in wartime. Parlor roller pigeons can't fly, but if you put them on the ground, they will flap their wings and turn somersaults. And I've actually seen people having contests to see whose parlor roller can do somersaults the longest. It's weird. They take these birds and they set them down on the ground, and the birds start flapping and they start rolling on the ground, and they measure how far they go. It's like watching somebody playing bocce with pigeons. Really strange. So behavior patterns vary. Intelligence varies. Homing pigeons are pretty smart. My old friend told me that Baharas are completely stupid. They're basically cucumbers covered in lots of feathers. So all of these features can be and have been modified through artificial selection. Just for fun, here's a non-animal example, and this is not one that Darwin mentioned. That's a plant native to the US-Mexico border region called the chiltepin. Very pretty plant, nice green leaves, and very attractive bright red berries. The berries are eaten by birds, and then the birds poop the seeds out and spread the plant. Mammals can digest the seeds, so this plant has a chemical compound in its berries that makes it very painful for mammals to eat, causes severe irritation in mammals' mouths. Roughly 8,000 or so years ago, some humans found some chiltepin and ate the berries. And after feeling agonizing pain in their mouths, they looked at each other and said, "Hey, I want some more." So what they did was pick out chiltepines plants that had larger berries or slightly less burning berries, or more berries, or maybe more vigorous plants overall, whatever it might be. Chiltepin plants that had berries that people liked would get their seeds planted. Chiltepines with berries that the people didn't like would probably end up in the stew. And the end result, after about 8,000 or so years, is most of the varieties of domesticated pepper that you know. Not habaneros and not some of the South American ones like ají peppers, but bell peppers, chiles poblanos, very popular in Mexican cooking at the upper right. Then cayenne peppers from your Cajun spice down there at the lower left. Medusa peppers on the right, grown for ornamentation, and hundreds more. Most of the peppers in the grocery store are descended from these little chiltepin berries. By the way, chiltepines are still grown, and they're extremely hot. I've heard them referred to as gringo killers. You can just add a few to your chili, and yeah, they'll be calling the fire department. Or consider tomatoes. Wild tomatoes are a South American plant with little berries that don't look much different from the chiltepin. And then breeders have developed everything from stuffer tomatoes that are hollow on the inside to yellow, what do they call those? I used to grow some. Yellow bulb tomatoes, I think, small and shaped like light bulbs. Green sausage tomatoes, which are elongated, very good for chefs because you can slice them into a lot of equal sized slices. Togo trifele tomatoes, which are pleated and folded, and all of the ones that you'd see in your supermarket, everything from Cherokee purples to the pink tomatoes they grow down in Southwest Arkansas, if anybody's from there. I forget the name of the town, but they've got a pink tomato festival every year. all of those varieties of tomatoes come from a wild stock. Darwin didn't invent this idea. People had been using it for many centuries before he came along. Darwin wrote a lot of letters to animal and plant breeders. He didn't get around very much when he was ill, but back in the day, the British Royal Mail was very fast and very efficient. You could, they would pick up and deliver the mail several times a day. And, you could write a letter to a friend of yours and get an answer back the same day sometimes. And Darwin wrote a ridiculous number of letters. We've actually got a set of the published volumes of the correspondence of Charles Darwin in the library. It's at least 20 big volumes, and I don't think they're even finished yet. So Darwin learned about this from people who were doing it professionally on the ground, livestock breeders and pigeon fanciers. He quoted a pigeon breeder that he knew that said that he could produce any beak shape that you wanted in 5 years. Just give him a possible beak shape and he would breed his pigeons and select the ones that were closest and keep doing that. And in 5 years, he'd have the beak that you wanted. But it goes back even farther than that. Buffalo Bird Woman was one of the last Native Americans of the Hidatsa tribe who remembered how farming had been done before European contact. The Hidatsa used to farm in the lowlands of the Mississippi River. They grew corn, beans, squash, and sunflowers. And in 1912, her son, I think, interviewed her, and she left an account of how they used to farm. Worth a read if you're interested in things like organic farming. She's got some very sound ideas, because the tribe lived or died by how well they could farm. And she said, I was very careful to select seed for the following points. Seed should be fully ripe. Seed should be of good color. Seed should be plump and of good size. Did I learn from white men thus to select seed? Laughing heartily. Ha, ha, ha. No, this custom comes down to us from very old times. You pick out the best seeds that have the traits that you want, plant those. The ones that don't have what you want are the ones that end up in the soup. And it's the kind of thing that any group of people would have figured out very early, especially if they've adopted agriculture and they live or die by how much food they can produce. This is the kind of thing that you learn very quickly if you're raising, if you're growing crops that you depend on. So even so-called primitive peoples understood artificial selection quite well. What sets Darwin apart is that he argued that nature could do exactly what breeders did, that nature controlled which varieties of animal or plant reproduced. You will hear people who are, whose brains are a little bit fried from listening to too many Hillsong records, tell you that they can't believe in evolution because evolution says we all got here by random chance. I have heard that more than once in this state. Here's the thing, natural selection says it's not random. It is not a matter of rolling the dice as to which individuals in a population reproduce and which ones don't. There is a random element in that, and we call that genetic drift, and I'll be talking about that later. But in natural selection, it's not random which individuals leave babies and which ones don't. Just as its breeders do not randomly select which individuals reproduce and which ones don't. And so nature does what breeders do, that's natural selection. And given millions of years, this is very Lyell, by the way, small changes adding up over millions of years, natural selection should be able to create all the diversity of life that we see from just a few very simple predecessors. What those were, we'll leave vague for now. But from some very simple starting point, you could produce the entire biosphere that we have. Now, the people that I have discussed this with who listen to an awful lot of Hillsong will tell me that, okay, selection can generate new breeds of thing. We've seen in our time new breeds of dog and cat and pigeon and tomato and things like that. We can observe, the appearance of new strains of bacteria and new strains of virus, like the new variants of COVID-19 that have showed up that are now about 1,387 on my list of things to worry about, but rising rapidly. So selection can generate new breeds, but it can't create new kinds of living things. The problem is that when people say this, they're usually not really giving a solid definition of what we mean by kind. We'll talk later about exactly what species means and how we define that. In fact, there's no single definition, but we'll look at various attempts to define species. But Darwin said this: here's two wild birds that are considered separate species. On the left is the rock pigeon. On the right is the Indonesian pink-necked fruit dove. The colors are different, of course, but the size is about the same. Aside from that pink head, the color is about the same. The shape of the beak is the same. The niches are a little bit different, but the diet is not impossibly different. I think they both eat seeds and fruit in the wild. Clearly, these are very similar species to each other, and you wouldn't blink if somebody told you they should be classified in the same family. Which are more different, rock pigeons and pink-necked fruit doves, or yellow Brunner powders and Ackerman tumblers? See what I'm getting at? Artificial selection can modify the structure of organisms so much that if you just gave these two birds to a specialist and told them, hey, I just found these birds in the wild, if that ornithologist didn't know already that these are varieties of pigeon, he might well classify them as separate species or even separate genera. Here we go again. There's the rock pigeon on the left, the bleeding heart pigeon on the right from the Philippines. Roughly the same size, beak is the same, coloration very similar. They've even both got bars on the wing. So which is more similar, these two wild species or the black fantail compared to the old Dutch capuchin? Okay, I think you see my point. We know that artificial selection can modify structure a heck of a lot. In the case of pigeons, it hasn't really taken that much time, just a few hundred years. And it can modify structure so much that you can end up with things that are so different from each other that it's not obvious that they come from the same ancestor unless you already know that. If you want an example that's a little closer to home than pigeons, wild cabbage is this noxious weed that lives in crappy soils in Northern Europe, and you'd have to be kind of desperate to eat it. But I guess they were desperate people, because people not only ate it, they started growing it. They've artificially selected it. And you end up with cabbage, kale, broccoli, cauliflower, Brussels sprouts, and kohlrabi. And I think even a few others. And if you didn't already know, you might not realize that the broccoli in your supermarket, which has those big flower heads, is the same species, descended from the same answer as the Brussels sprouts, which are lateral buds, or the kohlrabi, which I don't know if you know kohlrabi, it's not quite as popular, but it's a variety with these big swollen stems. If I didn't already tell you that they're all descended from wild cabbage, you might not think they were the same species. And Darwin's point is that there's no fixed difference between natural species and artificial varieties. And here he is making this point. I do not believe that any ornithologist would place the English carrier, the short-faced tumbler, the runt, the barb, pouter, and fantail in the same genus. And then evolution seemed to explain a lot of other biological facts. These are not things that Darwin himself discovered. These were things that were pretty generally known by the time he was working, but they seem to be explainable by evolution by natural selection. As he put it, a naturalist reflecting on the mutual affinities of organic beings, he means what they look like, their similarities, on their embryological relations, their geographical distribution, geological succession, and other facts, might come to the conclusion that each species had not been independently created, but had descended like varieties from other species. So here's one of those affinities that he mentions. Batwing on the left, seal flipper on the right, human hand in the middle. They do very different things. Bats fly, seals swim, humans play jazz piano. They do very different things, and yet the arrangement of bones is so similar that you can match them up bone for bone. Every bone you've got in your hand and arm is present in a seal flipper, a bat wing, a cat's paw. If you allow for some missing bones, you can even trace this into pig trotters and cow hooves and horse hooves. They all do radically different things, but it looks like they're built on a common plan, some modification of proportions, but still the same basic plan. Why? That relationship, by the way, is called homology, and we'll come back to homology much later, towards the end of the course. The concept was actually developed by a British scientist that Darwin knew, a rather unpleasant guy named Richard Owen. Owen's other claim to fame is that he looked at some funny bones that were getting dug up in the south of England and classified them in a new group that he called Dinosauria. So Owen gave the dinosaurs their name. But he'd also noticed this kind of relationship. Darwin asks why. Maybe it's because bats, humans, and seals, and probably other critters, inherited the same basic way of making an appendage from some very distant common ancestor that was not identical with any of them. And all three have modified that basic plan, but not tossed it completely. They've all inherited it from common ancestors. Maybe. So there's Richard Owen, so vain that all of his portraits he wore his academic cap and gown for. And he's holding a chambered nautilus in one hand. And he's already written that all vertebrates are variations on one archetype. And he coins the word homology to mean that kind of similarity. Darwin thought evolution by natural selection could explain why homology even exists. Vestigial structures. This is my favorite. This is human muscles. If you've ever watched a dog or a cat or a horse or a cow, you've seen them move their external ears, right? They'll flick their ears to get rid of insects. Dogs and cats certainly do a lot of signaling with their ears. You've seen dogs perk up their ears to mean they're happy, or droop their ears if they're scared. Or if they're a cat, they'll flatten their ears to show that they're about to eat your hand, or that's what mine do. You've got the same muscles in the same places. There they are. You've got your three auricularis muscles. Most people never learn to use them. Most people cannot wiggle their ears. Even if you can, ear wiggling makes no difference to your survival. I've asked people, and if your experience is different, you should tell me. But I have asked pretty often, and I've yet to find a person who's ever survived a potentially deadly situation by their ability to wiggle their ears. I've yet to find a person who was, about to be killed and got out of it by their ear wiggling ability. And I've yet to find a person who found a potential mate who said, "Oh, darling, I want us to have lots and lots of children, but I cannot get in the mood unless you wiggle your ears." Okay, now that I've said that, I think Rule 34 might kick in. So I'm sure that somewhere on the internet there is a site for ear wiggling fetishists. Ew. But by and large, ear wiggling makes no difference to your odds of surviving and reproducing. In animals, it does. It not only can signal emotions, animals can pick up sound by swiveling their ears around. You've all seen dogs prick up their ears to try to get a fix on where a sound is coming from. And they can swivel them to, to hear a sound more clearly. You can't do that. Why do you have these muscles that most people never learn to use and that are useless even if you did know how to use them? Huh. Could it be that you inherited these muscles from distant ancestors that did have the ability to wiggle their ears? Maybe. Then there's the whole thing that had been raised by the Galapagos. Why should these very young islands have so many species that are similar to the ones on the mainland and at the same time unique to themselves? Why does the Galapagos have 14 species of finch that are similar to the grassquit finches on the South American mainland and yet not the same? Why should the Galapagos have 14 varieties of giant tortoise that are all similar to each other, and yet each one is unique and each one is restricted to a single island or even a single mountain? Then we've got the study of embryos. Darwin didn't discover this. This had been shown by scientists like Carl von Baer and Louis Agassiz. And they'd shown that species that looked as different from each other as adults as turtles and chickens came from embryos that you could hardly tell apart. An early turtle embryo is almost indistinguishable from an early chicken embryo. Only a little bit later, that's the pictures down in the lower half, you can see in a later stage, the turtle is starting to develop a shell. But before that happens, in the pictures up above, you can hardly tell the diff. There's even cases where embryos of more complex species have features that look like the adults of less complex species. Why do chicken embryos have clefts in the neck region at the point where fish embryos would develop gills and gill slits? Why should they have that in the first place? You had clefts in your neck, pharyngeal clefts. Normally, those disappear almost with no trace, although you do keep one of them around. It's called your ear. The rest of them normally disappear. Why did you even have those in the first place? Why should you have a feature in your embryos that is shared with chickens, turtles, and fish? Why did you have a feature that looks like the beginning of a set of gills, even though it technically was not? You never actually had gills, but you did have these clefts that could have become gills, except they didn't. Why do you have them at all? And then paleontology. Darwin had already noted that there were fossils that seemed to blend characters of what we'd call separate groups. And then there's that odd resemblance between the fossils of a place like South America and the living forms in the same place. What could explain that? Why should you have, you know, giant armadillos in South America in the same area that you're finding smaller living armadillos? Why would that be the case? Okay, Darwin didn't go public with all of this right away. He spent 20 years gathering facts, trying to piece them all together. Just stating a hypothesis would be considered unacceptably speculative. Science had not really gone full tilt boogie onto this hypothetico-deductive method. And if Darwin had just proposed a hypothesis and done a couple of tests, nobody would have believed him. You know, he felt like he really had to nail this down. The political climate at the time meant that Darwin was kind of risking a lot. Be it said, just about every scientist who'd studied the problem agreed that the Earth was pretty darn old and that the life on it had come about by some kind of natural process that scientists were capable of studying. There weren't very many people, and there was really only one person I could think of, a guy named Philip Henry Goss, who was both a very well-trained scientist and deeply committed to the Earth being very young, just a few thousand years, with all of the species created exactly as they are now. There were very few people at the time we could call young Earth creationists. Most people accepted an old Earth and some kind of natural processes that directly created the biodiversity that we see, and maybe God was working through those processes. So it's not like everybody was a devout young Earth creationist and Darwin blows it all up. But it still did not do to get too public with this sort of thing. There was a book that was published anonymously in 1844 by a publisher named Richard Chambers called Vestiges of the Natural History of Creation, and it created a scandal. Everybody wanted to know who Mr. Vestiges was, who could possibly be the ungodly, unspeakable atheist who had... It was a sensationalist book, and one thing Darwin never was a sensationalist. He did not want people freaking out. He's, English and respectable and quite well off and has a certain social position. He certainly does not wish to endanger that. So he spends 20 years gathering any fact he can find, writing letters like a machine, reading voraciously, breeding his pigeons, learning about animal breeding from other animal breeders, spending 8 years studying living and fossil barnacles because he wants to do a detailed study of a biological group to see if his ideas work out, in detail. He writes 2 manuscripts that lay out his theory of descent with modification, but they weren't published in his lifetime. Darwin, being chronically ill, was afraid he was going to die young before he could get all of this out, and he left these manuscripts in a sealed envelope with a note to his wife and some money, saying, in effect, if I die, send these to my friends, and here's some money so that they can publish it, and I at least want to get some credit for what I've been racking my brains over for all this time. Those sketches were not published in his lifetime, though. And then he's puttering away at what probably would have been a 3-volume manuscript that would have explained all of this in agonizing detail. Darwin gets a letter from Alfred Russel Wallace, who's in the Day the Universe Changed video, who's been trooping all over Malaysia and Indonesia collecting beetles. and who'd come up with the idea while recuperating from a tropical fever. Wallace comes from a much poorer background, and Wallace was making a living as a professional collector. Museums and private individuals would pay money at the time for exotic specimens of animals, plants, whatever you could get. And so Wallace would go out to exotic parts of the world, make observations on large parts of the biosphere, and then kill it, stick it in boxes, and ship it back to the British Museum. So he was collecting beetles in Malaysia when he hit upon his ideas, and he wrote a letter to Darwin in 1858. And Darwin was just devastated because he was sure he was about to get scooped. As he said, "I never saw a more striking coincidence. If Wallace had my manuscript sketch written out in 1842, he could not have made a better short abstract. So all my originality, whatever it may amount to, will be smashed," Darwin writes to his friend Charles Lyell. What to do? You can find books claiming that Darwin basically screwed Wallace out of credit because Darwin had friends in high places and Wallace was kind of, this outsider in the establishment. My read on it is that everybody involved did try to be fair. Wallace does deserve a share of the credit, and his name deserves to be better known. They compromised, and Darwin put together a journal paper that was his ideas mixed together with some of what Wallace had written about in his letters, and they published it as a joint paper in 1858. So as we tend to measure credit, both men get a share. And as I've said, some people have argued that Darwin was cheating Wallace, but Darwin had been working on this since 1837. And he didn't tell most of his friends what he was up to, but he did have an inner circle that knew what he was up to. Lyell was in it. The American botanist Asa Gray was in it. And Darwin cut down that book to a more manageable length, that 3-volume thing he was writing. He trimmed it and published On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection in December of 1859. You might expect the public's reaction was rather strong. Darwin hadn't actually said anything directly about human evolution. He'd end up publishing a book called The Descent of Man in 1876, I think. The Origin of Species actually says nothing about people, well, very little, but it did not take long for people to realize that evolution had some extremely unflattering implications. Like this gorilla beginning to wonder, am I a man and a brother? Real quick, I know we've just got a couple minutes. The point of the cartoon was that Darwin's family had always been outspoken anti-slavery activists. Britain still had slavery in its colonies when Darwin was a young man. John Edmonston had been a slave in a British colony in what's now the country of Suriname, and there was still slavery in Jamaica. But Britain finally outlawed it in, I believe, 1834. It was when Darwin was still on the Beagle. Outlawed it in its colonies. Of course, it was still going strong in the United States. Darwin witnessed it in Brazil, and he absolutely hated it. As he wrote, these deeds are done by men who profess to love their neighbors as themselves. It makes one's blood boil, yet heart tremble, to think that we Englishmen and our American descendants with their boastful cry of liberty have been and are so guilty. Darwin's grandfather had created a popular image. He'd made these medallions. Darwin's grandfather was a potter Josiah Wedgwood, and he's created these medallions showing a chained slave. And I don't know if you can read the words, but the captions are, "Am I not a man and a brother?" And here in this cartoon, you have a gorilla asking exactly the same question. Darwin's raising the uncomfortable possibility that Englishmen might be related to not just Africans, but gorillas. We may all share a common ancestor. We might be related to the very people that we're trying to enslave. Ah, head explode, head explode. Am I satire or man? Play tell me who can and settle my place in the scale. A man in ape shape, an anthropoid ape, or a monkey deprived of his tail? So, yeah, this is kind of a big question at the time. And it certainly started a great deal of controversy. And we'll go ahead and, yeah, we'll come back to that. That's a good place to stop. I'm stopping recording now.